Hello my loves, and welcome back to another edition of the Ages of Chaos for the Fluff and Hammer adjacent. Moving on a little bit from Codex Chaos Space Marines 9.0 today, although we will be returning to that book to do the Red Corsairs at some point. Moving on to what I suppose is that book's sister codex today, and one of the more highly anticipated in Warhammer 40,000's 9th edition, which is of course Codex Chaos Daemons. Now, this is a really fascinating one. I've been, since the very beginning of 9th Ed, I've been wondering how on earth they're going to do this. 9th edition, although it places more primacy on the assault phase than, say, 8th edition did, where it was pretty much all about the fire phase. It was all about long-range firepower. 9th Ed has a bit more emphasis on the assault phase and lends assault-based armies and units a little bit more credence than quite a few editions have up until this point. It's always been a difficult balance in Warhammer 40,000 because it is a science fiction war game. So of course you're going to have armies that are festooned with really big, powerful, long-range science fiction weapons like laser cannons and disintegrator cannons and black hole-making grenades and all of that garbage. So, of course, assault-based armies have always had a little bit more difficulty. They've always needed a little bit more attention to make them work. In 8th edition, assault was not great. It was not really a favourable way of constructing an army if you were talking competitively, and very often assault-based armies just faltered in the first couple of turns unless they had some very clever tricks to pull. In 9th edition, they've tried to get around that in a number of key ways. So the more assault-based armies often have a lot of special rules that make them more durable, that give them a bit of a push when it comes to maneuverability or deployment and so on and so forth. The Daemons are one of the most problematic, and they often have been for many, not just for 9th edition, but for many, 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 many editions, because they are such a strange army. Even if you take the most long-range based force from this book, which is of course the forces of Zeech, there's just not a great deal of high strength or high frequency firepower here. Certainly not compared to, like, say, the Xenos forces, like the Tau, the Eldari, the Drukhari, even forces like the Tyranids, which can be sort of formulated to be either assault or long range based. There's just not a great deal here in that regard. Certainly nowhere near any of the other armies. They are almost entirely assault-based, or if you're taking a Zeech force, for example, they emphasize the psychic phase. So these guys, they have a very difficult time. They've always had a difficult time ever since way back in 4th edition, when the Games Workshop made the very strange decision to split Daemons completely from Chaos Space Marines and make them their own army. Now, within the background, there is plenty of justification for that, and also within the history of the game, there's plenty of justification for that. Back in 2nd Ed, you had Demon World armies, which were actually very, 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 very good indeed, which not only included demons, but also ported over basically everything from the fantasy game system, and I mean even Chaos Knights, Chaos Knights, Chaos Warriors, Chaos Marauders, Chaos Trolls. All of those guys you could take in a Warhammer 40,000 army back in 2nd Ed, and the same was true in the Realms of Chaos days too. The difference was you could mix and match, so they were not on their own. If you needed firepower, then you could just intermingle stuff from the Chaos Space Marine army list. In 4th Ed, that just wasn't possible. There was no ally system, so you couldn't do that, and there was also no means within the codices themselves by which you could mix and match them. So they were really problematic. The way they tried to get around it was by giving demons special deployment rules, whereby they could sort of manifest out of the air, as they do, as they do in the background. That's how demons enter into the material universe. They coalesce from warp rifts or from particular concentrations of chaotic energy or emotional energy, or if, for example, a chaos cult has performed a particular ritual and opened a way into the warp, or opened themselves up for demonic possession, and so on and so forth. That's how they get into the material universe. But it's never really worked. It's always been a bit of a half-arsed, ham-fisted affair, where it was often as problematic as it was a benefit. In 8th Ed, Demons didn't fare too well. I think that's fair to say. They did not fare too well. 9th edition, they've done something very special with them. They've really, I would say for the first time ever, they've really sat down and thought around a table, okay, how are we going to make these guys viable? How are we going to make them function? What do they feel like to play? Because they're always going to be weird. The demons are always going to be a weird army in Warhammer 40,000. There is really nothing like them out there. And they've run with that with this new codex. They've really tried to make them something special, not only in terms of the way they play, but their ethos, the background. Demons and Chaos are obviously a core part of the background. They are part of what makes the Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar universes so special and so interesting. Chaos is at the very, very heart of the background and mythologies for these game systems. So it deserves something special. Now, one of the things they've done, which is absolutely wonderful, is they've introduced an allies system. So if you take a Chaos Space Marines army or one of the god-specific armies like the Death Guard, Thousand Sons, Emperor's Children, or World Eaters, then you can take a detachment of demons, up to 25% of your total force points. And if you do that, then any of the army-wide special rules still function, even though you've technically got units from another army. That's really wonderful. One thing you are going to see is a lot, and I mean a lot, of Thousand Sons armies backed up by Lords of Change and Pink Horrors, because they're brilliant in that regard. They plug a lot of gaps in the Thousand Sons army list. You're definitely going to see Pink Horrors, because Pink Horrors are amazing at holding objectives. In the Death Guard, you are very, very likely to see demonic detachments with Beasts of Nurgle, because Beasts of Nurgle are one of the surprise winners of this codex. They are absolutely brilliant, as are, bizarrely, Flamers of Tzeentch. Flamers of Tzeentch have always been very up and down as a unit. They've always had issues. They've never really found a place or a function for them in the army list. Now, Flamers are if you are running a Tzeentch or an undivided demon army, they are almost an auto take. They are absolutely wonderful. And again, in Thousand Sons armies, you're probably going to see quite a lot of them, because they're just that good. They are mobile. They're not very good in close combat, but they're not meant to be. Their Flames of Tzeentch capability, their warp fire capability, means that people aren't going to want to try and charge them in assault anyway, because they're just going to fire Overwatch. And if they fire Overwatch, they don't need to roll to hit, because it's a flamer weapon, and it's a good flamer weapon at that, with multiple attacks, quite high strength, good armor piercing, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's some good stuff here. In terms of their deployment, they have a sort of manifestation ability, which is actually, again, really considered and really, really good. It basically provides multiple different opportunities for deployment for every unit in the army. You can deep strike them as normal, like you would any teleporting unit, like, say, Terminators or whatever. Or you can do this very interesting thing where you can deploy them using your opponent's leadership as a sort of to determine the distance by which they can teleport onto the battlefield. So these guys, when you've got low leadership units in an army, these guys can teleport really close to them. And that is fantastic. Not only is it fluffy, because of course that makes a load of sense. Demons rely upon the weak-willed in order to manifest. They attack the psyches of their opponents, and they use the psyches of mortals as a sort of stepping stone into the material universe. It also gets over the problems, the innate problem of them being shot to bits as they try to get across the battlefield. It means that you can potentially get very, 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 very early charges and assault phases with these guys. It's particularly nasty with a lot of Demons of Zeech that have long-range capabilities, because it means they are actually going to be deep striking quite close and firing all of their weapons or using all of their psychic powers. It's very, very cool. There's also the ability to use warp loci, which are basically units that have the warp locus keyword, and they can use that to teleport or manifest a bit more stably. It's a great special rule, and I would say for the first time ever they've got it right. For the first time ever, it's a total benefit, and the way they've written it overcomes so many innate problems that the demons have generally had in Warhammer 40,000. Combined with that, they've actually gone old school with this way, 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 way back when. I think the last time they had it was in 2nd edition. Demons didn't have like just a generic invulnerable save. They had their own bespoke demonic save, and the demonic save was very unusual in that it gave them certain immunities and vulnerabilities. Back in 2nd Ed, that meant that they were almost immune. Their save was immutable. You couldn't modify it unless the attack was being made with something like, say, a psychic power, a psychic weapon, or a flamer weapon. Then you could, because demons have a particular vulnerability to those weapons. Here in 9th Ed, they've simplified that a little bit, so there's not all of these. In 2nd Ed, there was a whole page of caveats as to what affected demons, what partially affected demons, what did, what didn't, and so on and so forth. Here, the demonic invulnerability special rule basically means that all demons now have an unmodifiable save. Their save cannot be modified by anything. So it's like an invulnerable save, but it's not an invulnerable save. It's a demonic invulnerability save. So items, special rules, relics, etc. that affect invulnerable saves do not affect demons. On top of that, they each have 2 saves in their profile depending on their natures and their background-based immunities and durabilities. So they have 1 invulnerable save against firepower and then another against assault. So obviously, things like the Demons of Zeech, they are very vulnerable to assault because that's what they're like, that's their nature. But they have very, very good invulnerable saves against firepower. It's really, really cool. It means that these guys, once again, even if they are advancing across the battlefield, it means that they are much more durable. Much more durable. Another one of the rules which makes them really good in close combat is the Malefic Weapons special rule. Now, Malefic is a special term that applies only to weapons in a demon's arsenal. And what it essentially means is every weapon that has the Malefic ability, the demon or unit in question will always be able, in any round of combat, to make that number of attacks on top of any of their normal attacks in their profile or with other weapons. It's a really cool ability. And the fact that Malefic weapons can't be modified, they can't, like their hit rolls, they can't be affected by psychic powers or anything like that, so you can't diminish them. They will always get those attacks. That is very, 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 very good indeed. On top of that, they have the old demonic terror ability, which they haven't had for quite a while. Obviously, demons are phenomenally frightening to everyone and everything. They are supernatural entities. They're not even frightening in the way that the Tyranids are, for example, because they'll kill you and eat you. These are supernatural terrors from the collective souls of humanity and also the alien species out there. So they affect the leadership and the combat attrition tests of those who are within a particular distance of them, which in combination with the manifestation rules is really good, and arguably one of the most brilliant special rules they have is the warp storm effects. Now, they did have a version of this in the last codex, but it was a bit problematic, it was a bit random. Now, the way it works is you don't roll on a random table, thank Zeech, by the way, for that. Basically, you roll a series of dice at the beginning of any turn. For each roll of I think it's 4+, you gain 1 warp storm point. There are ways of getting extra warp storm points through psychic powers and through relics and so on and so forth. And then you have 5 lists of special abilities that when you use warp storm points to invoke them, they take immediate effect, and they affect every unit in the army. That's very important. They immediately affect every unit in the army. So you have an undivided list, which any demon can use. Then you've got a Khorne list, a Nurgle list, a Slaanesh list, and a Zeech list. And this is a really cool special rule. It means that the demons are slightly unpredictable. The opponent is never really going to know what warp storm effect you're going to pull out of the fire. But on top of that, it makes them simpler to use. It's simplified the use of the army list. So most of the actual units, the actual the demonic entries in the Codex, they've been simplified massively. A lot of special rules have been removed. So you only have their basic special rules, their weapons options, weapon profiles, and their characteristics. That's largely it. And many of the more abstruse special rules have been relegated to either psychic powers or to the warp storm table. And it makes everything much more user-friendly. It makes them, not only that, but they've all had buffs as well. Almost every unit in the Codex has had some really significant buffs. Slaanesh armies, for example. I think Slaanesh armies, a lot of people have been saying that Slaanesh is the weaker of the army list. I disagree. It's different from the others, but its strength is how fast it is. The slowest thing in the army list moves 9 inches per turn. That's the slowest thing. The fastest thing moves up to 20 inches. These units, Slaanesh armies, are going to close with the enemy. On top of using the manifestation special rule, they are going to close with the enemy really, really quickly. And once they close, they can do the business. You better believe it. They've got so many attacks, it's unbelievable. Many of which can be enhanced by their warp storm effects. So, for example, like in the old Codex, there were lots of abstruse special rules about returning destroyed models to a unit, healing wounds and whatnot. Now that is all contained within one warp storm effect, one undivided warp storm effect, so it can be purchased for anyone, which is Dark Invigoration, which if you spend the warp storm points on it, allows you to heal and also return destroyed models to a unit. So the demons re-manifest effectively. It's really cool. It's interesting. It's fun. It means that you can turn the tide of a battle if you're lucky by making the right selection, or if you have a lucky warp storm roll, if you get enough dice. It's very, very cool. Almost everything has had a massive buff in this. Greater demons are largely amazing in this codex. In particular, I mean, for myself, the one I've been looking at is definitely the Lord of Change. Taking a Lord of Change in either this army list or in a Thousand Sons army list as in its own demonic detachment with maybe some pink horrors to back it up. That is a very, very, very strong combination indeed. It's an amazing psyker. Outside the likes of Magnus the Red, there really isn't much that stands up to it. It's one of the best psykers in the game, and can be further buffed with things like relics, with exalted abilities. There's this whole thing with exalted demons. which is very simple now. To elevate a demon to exalted status, you have three options from each of the gods, and you can just buy it as an upgrade, and it's a special rule that applies to the greater demon, and that's the way it works. The book is brilliantly subdivided. One of the other problems with the previous Demons codices is that most players, not all of them, but most players like mono-god army lists. They tend to like to specialize. But the problem with practically all of the previous Demon codices is that some mono-god armies worked, most didn't. Most just did not work. They were not only not competitive, they were not fun, because you were just immediately hamstringing yourself. This book subdivides itself into basically 5 little army lists, 4 for each of the Chaos powers, and then there's a special army of renown, it's the big Chaos Undivided army, which is Balakor's army. And Balakor's army is this wonderful polyglot thing where you can take units from the Demons Codex, the Chaos Space Marines Codex, and from the Chaos Knights Codex all in one army list. It is absolutely wonderful. Very unusual, kind of unwieldy, but really cool, right? Really, really cool. But each of the books of the gods, which, by the way, are wonderfully designed and presented, really atmospheric, have their own bespoke stratagems, they have their own exalted abilities, they have their own psychic laws, all of which are good. All of which are good. My personal favourite is the Soul Stain discipline, which is for Slaanesh units. They have their own warlord traits, their own relics, and it all works. It feels like time has been taken to make each of the god-specific army lists viable. I mean, some of them are definitely more workable than others. I think you're going to be seeing a lot of Tzeentch out there. A lot of Tzeentch, because Tzeentch demons are nasty. They are very nasty indeed. There are some combinations of psychic powers and units here that are pretty damn good, it has to be said. Beyond that, the ethos of the book, they've really thought hard about what demons mean in the grimdark of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it's presented in this really dynamic way. The background is really interesting. There's this those of you who've read Clive Barker's Mr. Be Gone, which is a book that's possessed by a demon and talks to the reader, they've kind of done a similar thing here. There's this running joke throughout where you've got like some inquisitorial like a cultist or archivist who talks to the reader. He says, don't go any further, don't read any further, this book will damn your soul. And eventually you turn to a particular page and it's just black and it's surrounded by all these arcane symbols, and there's like the suggestion of a demonic face leering through. It looks like Balakor actually, and the little missive at the side says, it's too late, your soul is damned, oh, you didn't put the book down, etc, etc. It's really cool. There's wonderful artwork in this book. In terms of the artwork, the background writing, and the presentation, this is one of my favourite codices for 9th Ed by a country mile. One of the things they've done is they've tried to, rather than just reproducing the old background material in exactly the same way that we've seen it reprinted a million times over, they've tried to think about different ways of presenting the Chaos powers themselves and their demons and their ethos and the emotions that fuel them in interesting and unique ways. There's also, depictions of the Chaos powers themselves that are new, which I've never seen before, and they are really beautiful. My personal favourite is the depiction of Slaanesh, which is absolutely amazing. It is one of the best depictions of Slaanesh I have ever seen. It is beautiful. There's background and artwork just all the way through this book that is very different from the sort of in-house style that we've come to expect. It's much more varied, it's much more dynamic. There's loads of background about how demons manifest, how they get how they function when they're not actually manifested but they're whispering into the minds of mortals, what emotions fuel them, how they are summoned to the material universe by cultists and whatnot. It's really wonderful. It's got such atmosphere, this book, and I've got to say I'm very impressed. It's easily one of my favourite books for 9th edition, and I'm really tempted to either go for a Tzeentch demon army or a Slaanesh demon army. I think I'm going to go for Slaanesh actually. I mean, I know I've got my Thousand Sons, but man, the way Slaanesh armies work is so interesting, and there's so much you can do with them to make them aesthetically fun, to like build the army list and make it fun, make it interesting. I'm basically all in with this. My only tiny bone of contention is that this would have been an amazing opportunity to introduce some of the demonic units that exist in AOS that should exist in Warhammer 40,000 as well, right? Like the Sinessa and Dexessa, the children of Slaanesh, right? They are demons, so they exist in both universes, just like all other demons do. This was an ideal, and I mean ideal, opportunity to introduce them, but they don't, sadly. Which is a real shame. That's a real shame. Things like the Gaunt Summoners. The Gaunt Summoners could easily exist in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and they could have really, like, introduced them, but it's a minor gripe, it's a minor nitpick. I'm sure that will probably happen at some point. But yeah, I'm really pleased with this book. It feels like effort has gone into it. It feels like it wasn't a throwaway codex. They didn't just throw it out as like an ally book for other armies. It feels like something they've really considered and put effort into. And in that regard, I'm very pleased with it. Very pleased indeed. Now, when we come back, I will take a look. I will do some short appendix videos on each of the books of Chaos in this tome, starting with the Book of Khorne, which is the first one in the book, and then going on through Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and then the very last book, which is Bailacor's. So yeah, when we come back, my loves, the Book of Khorne. Until then, bye bye.